The Viking Age is generally considered to have spanned from the late 8th century to the mid-11th century, a period marked by exploration, trade, warfare, and cultural transformation across Europe and beyond. It did not emerge suddenly but developed out of centuries of Scandinavian life, shaped by geography, resources, and social structures that favored seafaring and mobility. By the late 7th century, Scandinavia, comprising modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, was home to a network of small kingdoms and chieftaincies. These societies were organized around kinship, local assemblies, and a warrior elite. Their world was rich in oral tradition, myth, and ritual, and although they were skilled farmers and traders, the limitations of their land encouraged expansion across the seas. The key technological factor was the clinker-built longship, a vessel capable of navigating both open oceans and shallow rivers, giving its crew unmatched versatility. The traditional starting point of the Viking Age is the year 793. In that year, a sudden and violent attack struck the monastery of Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of England. Lindisfarne was an important center of Christian learning and devotion, and the raid shocked Christian Europe. Chroniclers describe the Norsemen, later called Vikings, as heathen marauders who slaughtered monks, seized treasure, and desecrated holy sites. This event was not the first Scandinavian contact with the British Isles, but its brutality made it a defining historical marker. In the years immediately following Lindisfarne, Viking raids became increasingly common along the coasts of England, Ireland, and the Frankish Empire. These expeditions were seasonal at first, with warriors returning home after summer campaigns. By 795, raids reached the island monasteries of Iona and Rathlin, off the coast of Scotland and Ireland. The Norse approach combined shock tactics, speed, and the element of surprise. Monasteries, wealthy and lightly defended, became frequent targets. The first 2 decades of the 9th century saw expansion of Viking activity southward into the Carolingian Empire. The Franks, under Charlemagne and later his successors, attempted to defend river systems by fortifying towns and building watchtowers. Despite these measures, Viking fleets penetrated deep inland via major rivers such as the Seine, Loire, and Rhine. They plundered cities including Rouen, Nantes, and Hamburg. In 845, a large Danish force sailed up the Seine and besieged Paris, forcing the city to pay a massive ransom to withdraw. Meanwhile, Norse expeditions moved west across the Atlantic. Norwegian Vikings discovered and began to settle the Faroe Islands, Shetlands, and Orkneys. By around 800, they had reached Iceland's shores, although large-scale settlement there would come later. In the Irish Sea, Vikings established a presence on the Isle of Man, using it as a strategic base for raids and trade. Dublin, founded by Norsemen in 841, became one of the most important Viking towns outside Scandinavia, serving as a hub for commerce, craft production, and slave trading. The 9th century also witnessed a shift from purely raiding to more permanent settlements. In England, Viking armies began to overwinter rather than return home, suggesting long-term ambitions. In 865, the so-called Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia, led by commanders including Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson. Unlike earlier raiding parties, this force aimed at conquest, moving from kingdom to kingdom in England. Within a decade, much of northern and eastern England, later known as the Danelaw, came under Scandinavian control. In Ireland, the pattern was similar. Initial attacks gave way to fortified Longfort settlements, which served as bases for trade, administration, and further expansion. Norse and Gaelic cultures began to blend, resulting in a unique hybrid society in coastal regions. Norse settlers intermarried with locals, adopted elements of Christianity, and left a lasting imprint on Irish politics and economy. By the end of the 9th century, the Viking world stretched from North America's fringes though these explorations were not yet widely known to the steppes of Eastern Europe. Swedish Vikings, often called Varangians in this context, traveled along river routes through modern-day Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. They established trading posts like Novgorod and Kiev, linking Scandinavia with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates via vast trade networks. These routes brought silver, silks, and spices northward, while furs, amber, and slaves moved south. This early phase of the Viking Age was characterized by expansion, adaptability, and the forging of far-reaching connections. The Norse combined military force with trade diplomacy, creating a dynamic and often unpredictable presence across continents. The groundwork laid during these first decades would set the stage for the political transformations and legendary voyages that defined the next century of Viking history. As the 10th century opened, the Viking world had become a network of settlements, kingdoms, and trade routes that stretched from the edge of North America to the heart of Asia. The transition from raiding to ruling was already underway in several regions, as Scandinavian leaders sought not only wealth, but also political power and stability. In England, the Danelaw remained a distinct cultural and political zone, governed largely by Scandinavian rulers and their descendants. The boundaries between Norse-controlled territories and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were fluid, shaped by warfare, treaties, and intermarriage. One of the most notable moments of the early 10th century came in the year 927, when King Athelstan unified much of England under his rule, temporarily curbing Viking ambitions. Yet Norse influence remained strong in northern England, particularly in York, a major Viking stronghold. Across the Irish Sea, the Norse towns of Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, and Limerick flourished as maritime hubs. Here, Viking merchants engaged in trade that connected the Irish coast to the wider North Sea world. Ships from Dublin sailed to Norway, the Scottish Isles, and even the Mediterranean. In some cases, alliances between Norse leaders and Irish kings were cemented by marriage or shared enemies, showing that the Viking presence was not always one of pure hostility. Meanwhile, in the Frankish realms, Viking pressure in the 9th century had led to settlements in what would become Normandy. In the year 911, the Frankish king, Charles the Simple, granted land to the Viking leader Rollo in exchange for his loyalty and defense of the realm's northern frontier. This grant formed the foundation of the Duchy of Normandy, a region that retained strong Scandinavian cultural traits even as its rulers adopted the French language and Christian faith. The descendants of these settlers would play a pivotal role in European history in the centuries to come. Further east, Swedish Vikings, or Varangians, were expanding their influence deep into the river systems of Eastern Europe. They controlled key trade routes between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, forming early states such as Kiev and Rus. These Norse rulers and their Slavic subjects created a hybrid political culture that blended Scandinavian warrior traditions with Eastern Orthodox Christianity after the baptism of Prince Vladimir in the year 988. This eastern sphere of Viking activity was more oriented toward commerce and diplomacy than constant raiding, though warfare remained a tool of power. In the North Atlantic, the spirit of exploration pushed beyond Iceland. Around the year 985, Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, sailed west and established settlements in Greenland. These Norse communities endured for centuries, surviving in harsh climates by farming, hunting, and trade. Greenland also became a launching point for voyages farther west. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, is believed to have reached the shores of Vinland, likely part of modern-day Newfoundland, around the year 1000, making the Norse the first known Europeans to set foot in North America. Domestically, Scandinavian homelands were undergoing their own transformations. The consolidation of power by kings in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden gradually reduced the independence of smaller chieftains. These monarchs sought to centralize authority, standardize laws, and promote Christianity. The conversion process, while uneven, accelerated during the 10th and early 11th centuries, often driven by political expediency. Kings saw the Christian Church as a means to legitimize their rule and connect with the broader European order. One of the most influential rulers of this era was Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, who reigned in the late 10th century. He is credited with uniting much of Denmark and Norway under his authority and promoting Christianity across his realm. Monumental runestones erected during his reign proclaimed his achievements, blending pagan artistry with Christian symbolism. His legacy would extend beyond his lifetime, as his successors continued to shape the political landscape of Northern Europe. The late 10th century also saw renewed Viking incursions into England, particularly under the leadership of Danish kings such as Sweyn Forkbeard. These campaigns were not mere plundering expeditions, but strategic moves toward conquest. The political fragmentation of England made it vulnerable, and Viking forces exploited this by demanding tribute, known as Dangeld, and by seizing territory. The conflicts of this period set the stage for the climactic struggles of the early 11th century, when Scandinavia would briefly dominate the English crown. By the dawn of the new millennium, the Viking Age was approaching both its height and its turning point. The Norse had achieved remarkable feats of exploration, settlement, and cultural exchange, but the forces of political consolidation, religious change, and growing resistance from other European powers were beginning to reshape their world. The next decades would witness both their greatest political triumphs and the gradual fading of the Viking era as it had been known for over 2 centuries. The early 11th century marked both the peak and the beginning of the decline of Viking dominance. During this period, Scandinavian rulers achieved unprecedented political influence, forging empires that linked the North Sea world under a single crown. At the same time, the processes of Christianization, state formation, and integration into European political structures were transforming the nature of Viking power. In the year 1014, King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark successfully invaded England, becoming its ruler. His reign was short-lived, ending with his death the following year, but his son, Canute the Great, inherited his ambitions. By 1016, Canute had secured the English throne, and over the next decade, he extended his authority over Denmark and Norway as well. This North Sea empire represented the high point of Scandinavian political unity, with Canute ruling vast territories connected by trade, military strength, and a shared maritime culture. Canute's rule brought relative stability to England, as he skillfully balanced his Scandinavian warriors and the native Anglo-Saxon nobility. He promoted Christianity, endowed churches, and maintained diplomatic relations with powerful rulers in Europe, including the Holy Roman Emperor. His reign demonstrated that Vikings could be more than raiders; they could be statesmen, capable of building durable political structures. Yet this unity did not last beyond Canute's lifetime. After his death in 1035, his empire fragmented as rival heirs and regional powers vied for control. England eventually returned to native rule under Edward the Confessor, though Scandinavian influence remained strong in coastal regions and among the nobility. In Norway and Denmark, the struggle for kingship continued, with competing factions weakening the coherence of their realms. While political fortunes shifted, the Viking spirit of exploration persisted. Greenlandic Norse maintained their settlements, and trade routes, linking Scandinavia to the Mediterranean and the Middle East, continued to thrive. However, the balance between raiding and trade was tilting steadily toward peaceful commerce, in part because fortified coastal defenses and organized navies in other kingdoms made large-scale raids increasingly costly and risky. By the mid-11th century, Christianization was nearly complete across Scandinavia. Pagan practices lingered in some rural areas, but the public rituals, temples, and sacrifices that had once defined Norse religion were giving way to churches, bishops, and written law codes. The adoption of Christianity tied Scandinavian kingdoms more closely to the rest of Europe, but it also eroded some of the cultural distinctiveness that had fueled the earlier Viking identity. One of the final dramatic episodes of the Viking Age unfolded in the year 1066. That year saw two major invasions of England, one led by Harald Hardrada of Norway, the other by William Duke of Normandy, a descendant of Vikings who had settled in France generations earlier. Harold's campaign ended in defeat at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where the English king Harold Godwinson repelled the Norwegians in a fierce and costly fight. Only weeks later, Harold faced William at the Battle of Hastings and was killed, ushering in Norman rule over England. Harald Hardrada's death at Stamford Bridge is often taken as the symbolic end of the Viking Age. While Scandinavian warriors continued to serve as mercenaries, most famously in the Byzantine Varangian Guard, and Norse trade routes remained active, the era of large-scale Viking raids and territorial conquests was over. The kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden increasingly resembled their European neighbors in governance, religion, and military organization. The legacy of the Viking Age endured long after its political structures faded. Norse exploration left traces in North America. Their settlements reshaped the demographics and economies of the British Isles, Ireland, and parts of continental Europe, and their maritime skills influenced shipbuilding traditions for centuries. The sagas, runestones, and archaeological finds that survive today preserve a record of a people who combined boldness in travel, adaptability in settlement, and a capacity for both war and diplomacy. By the close of the 11th century, the world the Vikings had helped shape was no longer the same as the one they had entered in the late 8th century. Their era of dominance had passed, but the imprint they left on the cultural, political, and economic landscapes of Europe was indelible. The Viking Age had not been a single story of conquest or piracy. It had been a complex chapter of transformation, exchange, and integration that connected distant shores and diverse peoples in ways that would echo throughout history.